The siren cut off mid-wail, leaving a sharp silence that felt louder than the noise before it, and in that hollow space, Aaliyah Carter realized every eye on the sidewalk was suddenly fixed on her. She was 14, small for her age, still wearing her school backpack, when Officer Daniel Reeves' voice cracked through the afternoon air, hard and impatient, telling her to get down, no, lower, until her knees touched the concrete. The heat from the pavement burned through her jeans as confusion rushed in faster than fear, because she hadn't done anything except wait at the bus stop and answer a question too softly for his liking. People slowed, phones half raised, unsure whether to record or retreat, and Aaliyah felt the weight of their hesitation pressing her shoulders down as surely as the officer's command. Reeves stood over her with practiced authority, hand near his belt, his tone sharp enough to slice dignity clean in half, while she stared at the cracks in the sidewalk and tried to breathe without crying. Somewhere in the distance, traffic hummed like nothing extraordinary was happening, and that contrast, the ordinary world continuing while her own narrowed to the space beneath her knees, made her chest ache. She thought of her father, Chief Marcus Carter, thousands of miles away on active duty, and the way he used to kneel to meet her eyes when she was scared, telling her to stand straight no matter who tried to make her feel small. That memory collided with the present as Reeves repeated the order, louder now, drawing a line of control that felt absolute. Aaliyah's hands trembled, not from guilt, but from the shock of being treated like a problem that needed to be put in its place. And when her palms touched the ground, a murmur rippled through the onlookers. Among them stood Captain James Holloway, off-duty, uniform concealed beneath a jacket, watching with a tightening jaw as the scene unfolded in a way he recognized too well, not from training manuals, but from moments when power was misused because no one challenged it. He didn't move yet, not because he was unsure, but because he understood the gravity of timing, the way one deliberate action could shift the balance of an entire moment. As Aaliyah knelt, the city seemed to hold its breath, unaware that something was about to break the pattern everyone had come to expect. Officer Daniel Reeves felt the familiar surge of control settle into his posture as the crowd adjusted itself around the scene, some stepping back, others lingering with the cautious curiosity of people who wanted to witness without becoming involved. He noticed the phones now, hands lifted just high enough to record, but not high enough to be obvious, and irritation flickered across his face as he shifted his stance to block a clearer view. "Stay where you are," he said to Aaliyah, his voice lower now, edged with a warning that suggested movement itself would be interpreted as defiance. Aaliyah swallowed hard, her knees screaming against the rough pavement, her mind racing through every rule she had ever been taught about staying safe, about compliance, about surviving encounters that seemed designed to strip you of choice. She wanted to explain herself, to say she was just waiting for the bus, to ask why this was happening, but the words lodged in her throat, heavy with the understanding that explanations were not what he was looking for. Nearby, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks clutched her purse tighter, whispering under her breath that this wasn't right, while Officer Tom Walker stood a few steps behind Reeves, his eyes darting between the girl and his partner, uncertainty etched into his expression, but never quite reaching his feet. Captain James Holloway watched it all with a measured stillness, his military instincts cataloging details automatically, the officer's stance, the girl's age, the crowd's tension, the way authority was being asserted without cause. He thought of briefings he had given young soldiers about restraint, about the responsibility that came with power, and the bitter irony that here, in plain daylight, those principles were being ignored. Aaliyah's backpack lay slumped against her side, one strap twisted beneath her knee, and the sight of it, so unmistakably a child's, made something harden in Holloway's chest. Reeves asked a question that barely made sense, something about where she was coming from and why she looked nervous, and when her answer came out shaky and quiet, he scoffed as if fear itself were incriminating. The crowd murmured again, tension thickening like humidity before a storm, and somewhere in that charged stillness, Holloway made a decision. He stepped closer, not yet revealing himself, his boots stopping just short of the invisible boundary Reeves seemed to believe belonged only to him. Aliyah felt the shift before she saw it, the subtle change in the air, the sense that someone nearby was paying attention in a way that felt different, steadier, and for the first time since she had been forced to kneel, she lifted her eyes from the ground, unaware that the moment was beginning to turn. Captain James Holloway moved with deliberate calm, the kind that came from years of command where panic only made situations worse. And as he stepped fully into view, a few heads in the crowd turned, sensing a change they couldn't yet name. He stopped several feet from Aliyah, close enough for her to notice the polished confidence in his posture, but far enough to avoid escalating Reeves' defensiveness. Holloway slipped off his jacket slowly, revealing the crisp lines of his military uniform beneath, and the effect was immediate, like a quiet drumbeat sounding beneath the noise of the street. Reeves noticed too, his eyes narrowing as they flicked over the insignia, his grip tightening on the radio at his shoulder, as if authority were something that could be physically secured. "This doesn't concern you," Reeves said sharply, though his voice carried a fraction less certainty than before. Holloway didn't respond right away. He looked down at Aliyah instead, really looked, taking in her age, the way her hands trembled against the concrete, the stubborn effort she was making not to cry in front of strangers. In that instant, he saw not a suspect, not a situation to be managed, but a child bearing more weight than she ever should have had to. Without a word, Holloway straightened, heels clicking together, spine rigid, and raised his hand in a precise, formal military salute, directed not at Reeves, not at the crowd, but squarely at Aliyah Carter. The silence that followed was so sudden it felt physical, like pressure in the ears, and even traffic noise seemed to recede in deference to the gesture. Aliyah stared up at him, confused at first, then startled, her breath catching as she recognized the respect in that simple act. One by one, other service members in the crowd, Sergeant Luis Ramirez among them, stepped forward instinctively, drawn by training and shared understanding, snapping to attention and joining the salute without needing to ask why. Reeves' face flushed as the meaning began to register, his authority suddenly dwarfed by a different kind of power, one rooted not in force, but in honor. Officer Tom Walker shifted uneasily, his eyes widening as he realized the situation had crossed into territory Reeves hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Brooks pressed her mouth to her lips, tears welling as she whispered, "Oh my God," to no one in particular. Aliyah felt something loosen inside her chest, a fragile but undeniable sense of being seen, and though she was still kneeling, the salute lifted her in a way no command ever could. Reeves opened his mouth to speak, to reassert control, but the words stalled as the crowd's phones rose higher, capturing a moment that could no longer be contained, while Holloway held the salute steady, unblinking, waiting for the truth of who she was and who stood behind her to land with its full weight. The weight of the salute seemed to press down on Officer Daniel Reeves in a way no shouted command ever had, and for a moment he stood frozen, caught between instinct and uncertainty as the crowd's attention shifted decisively away from him. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and brittle, and took a step forward as if to reclaim the space, but his movement only emphasized how alone he suddenly was. "You can put your hands down," he said to Aliyah, his voice softer now, edged with confusion rather than authority, though he didn't actually tell her to stand. Aliyah hesitated, unsure whether permission was real or another test, her eyes flicking briefly to Captain Holloway, who maintained his salute with unwavering focus. Sergeant Luis Ramirez joined him, posture rigid, eyes forward, the discipline of years etched into every line of his stance, and the sight of more uniforms forming a quiet line behind them began to draw murmurs from the crowd. Someone whispered that the girl must be military or related to someone important, and the speculation traveled fast, feeding the tension like oxygen to a flame. Reeves reached for his radio, thumb hovering as if backup might restore the balance he felt slipping, while Officer Tom Walker took a tentative step closer, his voice low as he murmured, "Maybe we should slow this down," though the words sounded more like a question than a directive. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks found her voice then, trembling but clear, saying aloud what many were thinking, that this was a child, that whatever protocol Reeves thought he was following had gone too far, and her courage seemed to loosen something in others nearby, drawing nods and quiet agreement. Aaliyah's legs ached, pins and needles shooting up her calves, but she stayed still, caught between fear of moving and the strange comfort of being protected by strangers who stood in silence on her behalf. Holloway finally lowered his hand, turning his attention to Reeves with a level gaze that carried no threat, only expectation. "She deserves to stand," he said evenly, and the simplicity of the statement left little room for argument. Reeves looked around, realizing the scene had already escaped his control, his earlier certainty eroded by the presence of witnesses, cameras, and a respect he could neither command nor ignore. As Aaliyah slowly pushed herself up from the pavement, dust clinging to her palms and knees, the crowd seemed to exhale collectively, unaware that the story unfolding was far from over, and that the salute, powerful as it was, had only opened the door to truths that would soon demand to be spoken aloud. As Aaliyah rose unsteadily to her feet, the stiffness in her legs making her sway for a moment, Captain Holloway shifted just enough to place himself slightly between her and Officer Reeves, not in a confrontational way, but with the quiet assurance of someone used to shielding others without spectacle. Reeves watched the movement closely, jaw tightening, as if calculating how much authority he still possessed and how much had slipped beyond reach. "I asked her a question," Reeves said, trying to recover his edge, though his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "She didn't answer clearly." Aaliyah opened her mouth, then closed it again, the words tangled in her chest. But before the silence could be used against her, Holloway spoke, his tone measured and calm. "She's a minor," he said, "and she's frightened. That usually affects clarity." Officer Tom Walker nodded faintly, emboldened by the presence of someone who seemed unafraid to speak plainly, and added, "We can verify who she is without this." Reeves shot him a look that promised consequences later, but Walker held his ground, eyes fixed on the growing number of phones recording every second. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks stepped closer, offering Aaliyah a bottle of water from her purse, her hands shaking as she pressed it gently into the girl's palm, and Aaliyah accepted it with a whispered thank you that barely carried over the ambient noise of the street. Sergeant Ramirez scanned the crowd instinctively, noting the arrival of a few more uniformed personnel drawn by the unusual sight of a public salute, their presence reinforcing the sense that something significant was unfolding. Holloway asked Aaliyah her name, and when she answered, her voice steadier now, he repeated it aloud, as if anchoring her identity firmly in the space. "Aaliyah Carter," he said, and the name seemed to ripple through the crowd, triggering recognition in one of the onlookers who murmured that she'd heard that last name before. Reeves stiffened at the sound, suspicion and unease flickering across his face as he glanced again at Aaliyah, reassessing her not as a faceless subject, but as someone connected to something larger than this sidewalk. Holloway continued, his gaze steady, asking if her father was Chief Marcus Carter, and when Aaliyah nodded, a hush fell so complete it felt deliberate. Reeves' expression shifted, the implications landing heavily as he realized the gravity of the connection, while the crowd leaned in, fully aware now that the encounter they were witnessing carried consequences far beyond a routine stop. The name seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning, and Officer Daniel Reeves felt a prickle of unease creep up his spine as the realization settled in piece by piece. Chief Marcus Carter was not just any officer. He was a highly respected active-duty military chief whose leadership had been featured in briefings, commendations, and news segments about overseas operations. And the recognition rippled through the onlookers as whispers spread with startling speed. Captain Holloway watched Reeves carefully, noting the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened not with confidence now, but with calculation. "Her father is currently deployed," Holloway said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, his voice carrying just far enough for the crowd and the cameras to catch every word. Aaliyah clutched the water bottle Mrs. Brooks had given her, her knuckles whitening as she fought the urge to cry, the reality of her father's absence colliding with the sudden knowledge that his name alone had changed everything. Officer Tom Walker cleared his throat, finally finding the resolve to speak more firmly. "We need a supervisor," he said, reaching for his radio before Reeves could object, and within moments, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell's voice crackled back, sharp and controlled, announcing she was en route. Reeves tried to reframe the situation, muttering about procedure and public safety, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears as he glanced again at the cluster of military personnel who stood silently, their presence a living reminder of discipline and accountability. Sergeant Ramirez exchanged a look with Holloway, an unspoken agreement passing between them that whatever happened next needed to remain calm, visible, and by the book. Mrs. Brooks, emboldened by the shift in momentum, spoke up about what she had seen from the beginning, her voice trembling but resolute as she described the order to kneel and the way the girl had been treated. Aaliyah listened, stunned that an adult stranger was defending her so openly, and with each word a little of the fear that had lodged in her chest began to loosen. The crowd pressed closer, not aggressively, but with focused attention, aware that this moment was becoming something that would be discussed far beyond this street corner. As sirens approached in the distance, signaling the arrival of supervision, Reeves wiped a hand across his face, the sweat there betraying his strain, while Holloway stood steady beside Aaliyah, a quiet sentinel as the scene moved inexorably toward accountability. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell arrived with a controlled urgency that cut cleanly through the murmur of the crowd, her patrol car pulling in at an angle that signaled command rather than chaos. She stepped out briskly, eyes already scanning the scene, taking in the military presence, the cluster of civilians, the phones raised like silent witnesses, and finally, Aaliyah, standing close to Captain Holloway, dust still visible on her knees. Mitchell's gaze lingered there for half a second longer than anywhere else before she turned to Officer Reeves. "Explain," she said, not raising her voice but pitching it with the authority of someone who expected precision. Reeves launched into his account, words tumbling too quickly, emphasizing compliance issues and vague suspicions, but Mitchell's expression didn't soften as she listened. She glanced toward Officer Tom Walker midway through Reeves' explanation, and when Walker met her eyes, he gave a slight shake of his head that spoke louder than any interruption. Mitchell nodded once, absorbing the contradiction, then turned to Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, who repeated her account clearly, hands shaking but voice firm, describing how the girl had been forced to kneel without cause. Mitchell asked a few short questions, each one tightening the focus of the narrative, before finally addressing Captain Holloway, who identified himself and calmly confirmed what he had witnessed. When Mitchell asked about Aaliyah's identity, Holloway deferred to the girl, and Aaliyah, heart-pounding, stated her name and her father's rank with quiet clarity, no longer shrinking under the weight of attention. The crowd fell nearly silent as Mitchell processed this, her jaw tightening slightly as she looked back at Reeves. "Body cams stay on," she ordered, then turned to Aaliyah and crouched to meet her eye level, her tone shifting noticeably. "Are you hurt?" she asked, and when Aaliyah shook her head, Mitchell nodded, acknowledging both the answer and the courage it took to give it. Straightening, Mitchell took a step back and addressed the scene at large, instructing officers to create space and requesting formal statements from witnesses. Reeves stood stiffly to the side now, no longer directing but awaiting direction, the hierarchy unmistakably realigned. As Mitchell began documenting the incident, Aaliyah felt the strange sensation of the moment no longer belonging to the officer who had started it, but to everyone who had chosen, one by one, to step into the truth of what had happened. As the immediate tension eased into a controlled stillness, Lieutenant Mitchell directed Officer Reeves to stand aside near her patrol car, her tone leaving no room for debate. And for the first time since the encounter began, he obeyed without protest. The crowd shifted again, this time not with fear or outrage, but with the focused patience of people who understood they were witnessing a process unfold. Captain Holloway remained close to Aaliyah, not crowding her, just present enough to remind her she was not alone, while Sergeant Ramirez quietly coordinated with other service members to keep the space calm and respectful. Mitchell began collecting statements methodically, her pen moving steadily as Mrs. Brooks spoke in careful detail, recounting the moment Reeves' voice had sharpened and the exact words he had used when ordering Aaliyah to kneel. Each sentence seemed to peel back another layer of the afternoon, transforming it from a chaotic confrontation into a clear sequence of choices and actions. Officer Tom Walker gave his account next, his voice steady but weighted with the knowledge that honesty carried consequences, admitting he had felt the situation escalate unnecessarily and had hesitated to intervene sooner. Mitchell listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, her expression unreadable but intent. Aaliyah was asked to sit in the back of Mitchell's car with the door open, a gesture meant to offer comfort rather than confinement, and as she settled onto the seat, the cool air felt like relief against her flushed skin. Holloway spoke quietly with her, asking about school, about what she'd been reading lately, grounding her in ordinary details that felt almost surreal after the intensity of the last hour. Across the street, Reeves watched the scene unfold, his earlier confidence replaced by a guarded stillness as he realized how thoroughly the narrative had shifted beyond his control. The presence of the military officers, the clarity of civilian witnesses, and the unwavering documentation by Mitchell all converged into something he could neither dismiss nor intimidate away. Sirens faded into the background as additional units arrived only to be waved off, the situation already contained. Phones continued to record, but now they captured a different image, a calm, deliberate response replacing an act of public humiliation. As Mitchell finished her notes and secured the recordings, she glanced once more at Aaliyah, then at Holloway, silently acknowledging the role his single, disciplined gesture had played in changing the course of the day, even as the larger consequences began to take shape just beyond the edge of the crowd. The sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the sidewalk as Lieutenant Mitchell concluded her documentation and made a quiet call that shifted the gravity of the moment yet again. Reeves watched her pace a few steps away, listening intently, her posture rigid with professionalism, and when she returned, the change in her demeanor was unmistakable. She addressed Reeves formally, informing him that he was being relieved from duty pending an internal investigation, and the words landed with a finality that drew a collective murmur from the crowd. Officer Reeves opened his mouth as if to argue, then seemed to think better of it, his shoulders slumping just enough to betray the shock beneath his restraint. Officer Tom Walker was instructed to take custody of Reeves' equipment, and as Walker complied, his movements were careful, almost solemn, aware that this moment marked a turning point not only for Reeves, but for the department itself. Across the street, Mrs. Brooks exhaled shakily, tears finally spilling as the weight of what she had witnessed and helped correct caught up to her. Captain Holloway stood beside Aaliyah as Mitchell explained what would happen next, her tone measured and reassuring, outlining the steps of the process without making promises she couldn't guarantee. Aaliyah listened closely, absorbing the words with a maturity that surprised even her, nodding when appropriate, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet resolve. When Mitchell mentioned contacting her father's command to inform them of the incident, Aaliyah's throat tightened, but she held her composure, trusting that the truth would reach him intact. Sergeant Ramirez received a brief call of his own, relaying updates to military leadership, who were already becoming aware of the situation through official channels and the rapidly spreading footage online. The crowd began to thin as people returned to their lives, though many lingered just long enough to catch one last glimpse of Aaliyah standing tall, no longer reduced to the ground she'd been forced to kneel upon. As Reeves was escorted toward a patrol car, his gaze briefly met Aaliyah's, but whatever he might have wanted to say remained unspoken. The street, once charged with humiliation and imbalance, now carried the subdued hum of accountability, and as the last of the sunlight faded, it was clear that the moment would not end here. It would follow everyone involved into the days ahead. Night settled fully by the time the street returned to something resembling normal, though the echoes of the afternoon lingered in ways that couldn't be seen. Lieutenant Mitchell arranged for Aaliyah to be driven home by a trusted officer, refusing to let her wait alone for the bus after everything that had happened. And as Aaliyah climbed into the back seat, she glanced once more at the place where she had been forced to kneel, now just an ordinary patch of concrete washed in streetlight. Captain Holloway walked her to the car, offering a small, respectful nod rather than words, understanding that some gestures carried more meaning in silence. Sergeant Ramirez did the same, the line of uniformed figures dispersing quietly, their presence no longer needed, but their impact indelible. At home, Aaliyah sat on her bed later that night, knees cleaned and bandaged, replaying the moment of the salute over and over, not as a symbol of rank or power, but as proof that dignity could be restored even after it had been publicly taken. Her phone buzzed with a secure message from her father, Chief Marcus Carter, sent through official channels, telling her he was proud of her strength and that he wished he could have been there, his words steady and grounding despite the distance between them. Aaliyah typed back carefully, describing the fear, the confusion, and the unexpected kindness of strangers, knowing he would understand the weight of every detail. Somewhere across the city, Lieutenant Mitchell filed her final report for the night, ensuring every fact was documented accurately, aware that scrutiny would follow and determined that the record would speak clearly for itself. Officer Reeves sat alone in a locker room, uniform folded, confronting the reality that a single moment of unchecked authority had unraveled years of routine. And in the quiet aftermath, as videos continued to circulate and conversations sparked in homes and offices far beyond that street, the image that endured was not one of force or fear, but of a young girl standing upright, her dignity affirmed by a silent salute that had shifted the balance of an entire scene without a single command being shouted.